we live in an age of movements. I mean, looking back, you had words like hope and change front and center in Obama's campaigns. And today we've moved even beyond that into things like Black Lives Matters, where we place our entire hope, our entire desires for change itself in these movements. And what we find ultimately is that when these movements hit stuttering points, when these movements begin to break down, one of the problems is that we lose hope not just in the movement, but in the ideology. And I think if we're honest, we recognize that the church itself began as a movement. And while it's run 2,000 years, this movement has hit stuttering points. This movement has been challenged. The church itself at times is a hindering block to our faith. And so I wanted to raise this question because if we lose hope in an ideology when a movement stutters, do we lose hope in the ideology of Scripture and the gospel itself when we're hurt by the church? And in all honesty, with that said, can we really place our hope in the teachings of the gospel and the teachings of Scripture, even when the church itself lets us down? To do that, I want to look through Scripture at what it says about hope. And this is one of the beautiful things about Scripture is from Genesis to Revelation, hope is laid out. I mean, you have verses like Jeremiah 29:11, which we're going to jump into next week or in the week to come, which says that God has plans for us to give us hope. We have verses at the end of Revelation itself, which are about the hope fully restored. And of course, we have verses like the end of 1 Corinthians, where Paul tells us that these three are left, faith, love, and hope. And this is where I want to start as we jump into what this series is really about. You see, I think if we look at words like faith, we look at words like love, and we look at words like hope, we want these things. We recognize that they are good. But G.K. Chesterton said something phenomenal about these things. You see, he said, unlike any other religion, Christianity itself is founded on paradox. And I think you can see this pretty clearly, pretty quickly, but when we talk about Christ, we say that Christ is God and man, and that's paradoxical. When we talk about God, we see God as three and one, and this is paradoxical. But Chesterton takes this further. He actually goes back to 1 Corinthians 13, and he says that faith, love, and hope, the core tenets of Christianity, are all paradoxical. You see, he says that love is paradoxical because to love someone and really love them, they have to be not worthy of that love. Otherwise, it's not love. He says faith itself is paradoxical because for us to have faith, we need doubt. We need reasons to doubt. And this brings me to hope because if we're going to talk about hope, one of the things that becomes clear in Scripture is that hope is paradoxical. You see, for hope to exist, we're in moments of direness. Where hope is strongest, where we're really hopeful, it's when in all honesty, we should have doubt of the future, doubt of our abilities, doubt that God is really going to show up. And so I want to walk us through Scripture over the next few weeks from Genesis to Revelation, zooming in on a few stories where in all honesty, all hope has been lost, or honesty, all hope should be lost. But what we're going to see in these weeks to come is God's response to sin in some of the darkest moments of Scripture. We're going to hold this up to a litmus test and say, is there hope here? What does the Bible really say about hope? What does the Bible really say about the character of God in the midst of human suffering and sin and oppression? This week in your discussion questions, you're going to dive in to 1 Corinthians 13 itself. You're going to look at some quotes from an early church leader. And you guys are going to begin this discussion. I hope you have a great time, and we'll look for you next week.